I'd like to say, so that this session is lameness, the causes and prevention strategies, and then it'll be followed after by a discussion panel. And they're both sponsored by Stubby's Precast. And once again, you don't realize if this was done commercially, we'd be paying twice or three times the price to come in. So to come in basically for your price of your lunch. It's your sponsors, and just let them know that the next time you see them at your farm or down the road, or they're the people that make this thing go. You're the participants, but we need them for the sponsorship. So we'd really like to thank the sponsors, all the sponsors for this day. So I have the pleasure to introduce Laurie Connor. She's a former professor and current senior scholar in the Department of Animal Science, University of Manitoba, where she has over 25 years experience in teaching and conducting research in areas of livestock reproduction, animal environment interactions, welfare and management relative to pig housing concepts. Her recent study included evaluating a large commercial group housing systems in terms of sow productivity and welfare, and a multi-institutional project assessing sow longevity and sow lameness. And I think that's the one thing we've heard today is the question keeps coming up. We keep seeing everybody talking about sow lameness. So here's somebody that's going to speak some on that. And she did the study in different housing systems and methods of early detection of lameness. It was a Manitoba project partnering with the pork industry that provided decision-making tools for pork producers to successfully convert to sow loose housing. It was a collaborative project and was completed in 2017. It was focused on optimizing flooring and social management of group housing gestating sows. So with that, I'd like to welcome up Dr. Laurie Connor for our speaker today.
Can you hear me at the back okay? Yeah, good, thank you for the wave. This is the first time I've used one of these. I feel like I should be singing you a song or telling you jokes or something, but neither of which I'm good at, so we'll just stick with the script here. First of all, I want to thank the organizers very much for inviting me to this meeting. I always enjoy attending producer meetings and participating in them, and the second reason is it feels kind of like coming home. I was raised just south of Hamilton. My mother was from Stratford, my father from a little farm near Kankora, so we used to travel a lot through here when I was, obviously things have changed a lot, but it still feels very good, so thank you very much for that. Sow lameness, certainly the second most common reason for culling following reproductive reasons, and can be anywhere between 8 to 15% with the culling or more, depending on the situation. And that is across housing, it's not just with loose housing. And some would question, if in fact this is a greater welfare concern in loose housing situations or group housing, because of the fact that these animals have to be able to walk around to access feed and other key resources that they need. And they also have to establish and maintain their position in the social hierarchy. So basically it impacts their welfare, which is critical, productivity and economics. Causes. I wish there was one cause, but obviously there's not. It's multifactorial, ranging right from the actual genotype and how that is expressed in the phenotype of the animal through to feeding strategies, nutrient intake, as well as the management of the facilities and the management of the animal. So obviously I'm not going to go into a lot of the details about these causes. These are definitely contributing factors. And we know that predisposing factors, include poor conformation, that genetic phenotype interaction, inappropriate flooring, intersow aggression, and poor space quality. And the stars are by the three that have been identified very clearly through scientific studies as well, and meta-analysis are definitely associated with lameness. But the other two, conformation and inappropriate management, those contribute to it. That's all part of the package. So the emphasis, I think, really needs to be on early detection, very early detection, as soon as possible, the treatment of animals that do appear to be lame, and preferably prevention. And so those are the things I'm going to talk a bit about. Selection, not so much, other than the importance, which I'm sure we all appreciate, of selection, not just in terms of conformation, which probably needs to be emphasized more in group-housed sows than it was in stalls, and perhaps, as some people have suggested, there needs to be more actual selection that's focused on the group housed animal, and as well, temperament of those animals, as well as the actual conformation. Quantity and quality of space is something that is sort of an area in which I've done a lot of work with Jennifer Brown and others at the Prairie Swine Center, as well as other collaborators. And these are the things I'll just briefly provide. I just lost my earring. Drama, but I found it, which is unusual. Usually I just lose them and then I never find them again, so sorry about that. So the things then that, if we talk about quantity and quality of space, okay, the actual amount of space, it's going to be affected by many factors, and we've heard about these things today. And so really, pen layout and configuration, feeding systems, the type of flooring, of course, which is key, and then the actual characteristics of the sow groups, their age or parity, okay, the size and number of animals, the dynamics. I'm not going to talk about the group characteristics, but I am going to provide some of kind of a review and overview of the other areas in terms of quantity and quality of space. So really, when we talk about the quantity of space, obviously it needs to be sufficient to allow access to those essential resources that each sow needs, and for them to be able to interact, which is a normal behavior in their social environment, to establish that hierarchy and to maintain it. And exploratory behavior, which is a sign of a sort of a well-adjusted, if you will, healthy sow, is that interest in actually exploring its environment. Crowding. We saw a fine example, thank you Sylvain for providing that video, and we've seen some other examples today of what crowding can do. It's obviously very difficult for some sows, and usually it's the subordinate sow, to actually get to resources. Most often it may be feed, but it may be water, it may be a preferred resting area. They're the ones that end up having to sleep on the dirty slats if you've got a lot of crowding. It promotes aggression and injuries, because they're not able to, they're encountering each other. There's a decrease, obviously, in the space that the sows would otherwise use for avoiding the aggression or fighting that they might like to avoid. There's going to be more injuries, and of course, as has been mentioned already, it's the lower ranking animals that are more vulnerable, and they are the ones that are probably going to be compromised the most. So crowding is a big issue. Adequate space, when it's provided, we see more exploratory behavior. The sows will engage in more just checking out the pen, and if there's things to chew on, they will chew on them. Preferably things that you have provided for enrichment, but they will chew on whatever happens to be available. And there'll be very few what we refer to as agonistic encounters, those aggressive interactions. And those are both indicators of well-being. Space allowance, yeah, we've got recommendations. Within Canada, the codes provide us with some guidelines, some recommended guidelines, but the actual amount of space per animal that is required, as I'm sure you realize, is going to be a function of several factors. And the ranges here for gilts and sows and mixed parity groups, the lower number would tend to be on something like total slatted floors, the higher number on solid, perhaps with bedding, those type of floors. So there's a range there depending on the flooring that you've got, as well as other factors. So those are guidelines, right? We really need to see the conditions that the animal are in to determine what that is. The quality of the space then refers really to what's in that space. How is it arranged? The configuration of it. And this is going to influence the ability of those sows to get to their key resources and the ease with which they can actually move around the pen. The pen layout and configuration, which you've heard about a few times today. The components of the pen environment. I guess I tend to emphasize, I know others have as well, but these animals really need very clearly defined areas or spaces for feeding, for drinking, for dunging, and for resting or loafing. Those are the sorts of things that are very meaningful and contribute to the minimal competition, that enhances the social stability in the group, and also those sorts of things contribute to decrease in sort of agonistic or aggressive behavior, which helps to decrease the incidence of lameness. So the layout of these pens, there's various ways in which it can be done, and one of the key things is that they can be laid out to allow for escape, the ease of movement and access to these areas. Space dividers, I mean, there's various ways, these are just examples. Space dividers that can provide discrete resting areas. We've seen pictures of them today, and you have some here too with the partitions, a solid area for the sows to, their bed or their resting area. Very effective, and they can then get into sort of these subgroups. Areas that in floor feeding system, I think this is the Arco, I'm going to press the wrong button here. The Arco station here that actually is a floor feeding type of system, or it's an example of one. But there's partitions there. And this is an ESF system with narrow hallways and the partitions. So they provide those resting areas, but also when you have subordinate sows or any sows that don't want to fight, they don't want to encounter, it gives them some place to hide and escape. And they use that very effectively. Resting areas, very important, that not only are they, maybe have partitions on them, but the sow can actually lie down and get up easily. And like it or not, that is most often on solid type of flooring. Okay? And so other conditions are about it, but that is very important for the sows to be able to do that, particularly in terms of issues like incidence of lameness. And the walkways need to be wide enough so that they can't be blocked again. And there were some other pictures, as well as a video shows you what can happen when the access alley is blocked. And so we recommend 7 to 10 feet between walls. We tend to, my group recommended 10, others have recommended 7. If you consider a sow 7 feet, about 7 feet long, if she lies down there, for a truly subordinate animal, she can block it. So those are sort of guiding, but the important thing is that it can't be blocked. Okay? And I think Jennifer also showed a fun example of one that was a little bit less, but why it worked in that particular situation. Summarily, failure to provide a good quality of pen space layout, it's going to lead to more prolonged aggression, distress in those animals, which we want to obviously avoid because it impacts so many things. The subordinate sows are more vulnerable. And when we have that increased aggression, that's one of the, it can be a major contributor to increased incidence of lameness. The flooring, which is a huge issue. Obviously, a number of things about the flooring itself are going to influence the animal. The abrasiveness of the flooring will affect injuries. Can be lying, can come in contact with that, but most often we're thinking in terms of things like the soles of the feet. Okay, the potential, for catching claws, the slipperiness, which can, if they're slipping, then sprains, those sorts of injuries, drainage and cleanliness, which can contribute to infections, bacteria, any wounds that are there, general dirtiness, and again, there's some research that certainly supports that in terms of the decrease in cleanliness or sanitation within a facility, increased incidence of lameness and the type of lameness that is associated with infections, and the ease of the comfort of the animal movement. Okay, not just that they can get from point A to B, but how easily are they doing that? Are they very stiff and very sort of tender and tentative? They can get there, but how easily? And this last one, not a popular topic in most of sort of North American facilities, especially the larger ones, is compressibility. Some materials, such as the rubber mats or straw, we see, less lameness. There's less abrasion. There's less impact influence on joints. So, inappropriate flooring is in fact a major cause of lying and walking discomfort, as we mentioned, lameness, feet injuries, which may or may not be reflected as actual incidents of lameness. Some of you have experience with it, and it kind of amazes me sometimes, the condition sometimes you'll see of sows' feet, but they're not displaying lameness when we're looking at them. They're very good at either hiding it, or else at that moment they're not necessarily feeling it. But there's obviously some real problems there, can become infected and can become problematic. In those situations where there in fact is pain associated with it, and some distress, that can very readily then be impacting performance and early culling. How many of those sows that are culled for reproductive reasons are also lame, perhaps chronically lame? Okay, and that just contributes to it. Anytime we see a chronic or situation of pain, we can expect that physiologically there's going to be some changes that may compromise reproductive performance. Now, this was a study that we did, this would be 8 years ago now, in terms of comparing two facilities that we had, one on concrete partially slatted floors, the other on straw. And basically looking at longevity in these two systems, because they've been in operation for a little over 4 years. And as you might expect, found that more of the sows that were on the partially slatted or the concrete floor, 21% of those calls for physical issues, versus those that spent their gestation period largely on straw was just under 7%, okay, 6.7%. And so what that really means is that more of the sows on the concrete slats had to be culled. So it's involuntary culling rather than your choice because of production reasons. And then in the alternative barn, there was more options there to actually choose, okay, that sow goes because her reproductive performance is down. Or instead of in the conventional, I have to keep her. She may not be producing very as well as I would like, but if I let her go, then our numbers are down. So this is fairly consistent, I think, across just that comparison. The incidence of lameness is greater on concrete slats. Sows prefer solid flooring and pins. And the European Union directive, in fact, requires a minimum amount of solid flooring. We don't do that. And I know that for many reasons, total slats are preferred. And largely it has to do with the manure and the removal, and also the fact that you require less space per animal on total slats. So how do we make some choices here? Ratios, the orientation of the slats, or ease of movement. You know, there've been some studies doing that. And then having to consider the functionality, the ability of the animal to walk comfortably, not catching their toes or claws, etc. And in general, the EU has minimums of 3-inch and just a little under an inch for slat and gaps. Recommended generally in Canada is 5-inch slat, 3/4 inch gap. A lot of ones are closer to an inch, if not more. Canadian code has no maximum and minimum. And so a number of years ago, a few years ago, last year we just finished it up, as part of an overall project, we were looking at optimal flooring, and we wanted to know sort of what is the most effective concrete flooring, because we recognized that even the EU directive with the minimum amounts, we couldn't find the actual scientific evidence for that as being best for sows, other than in terms of manure movement. So we wanted to do that, and what we did first of all is that we set up corridors with, and this is the example, corridors that with the slats oriented parallel, perpendicular, and the animal would walk either along the slat or across it. And this test corridor with video recorded these animals, and they had little reflectors on the back of them, and through kinematics analysis was determined basically that the preference was to walk actually perpendicular, okay, and summarily, I was conscious of the time here, that the gilt, we looked at both gilts, non-lame gilts, and some lame sows to determine what was the best and affected the gait the least. And so what we determined then was that in fact, the narrower slat, which was 105 millimeters, which is about 4 inches, and narrower gap, 19 millimeters, which is just shy of 3/4 of an inch, actually affected the gait of the gilts, which are probably your most vulnerable population. They're smaller. It affected it the least. The sows, not affected so much by what they were walking on or over in terms of their gait score. So we looked at a very detailed study where we followed gilts through to their first 2 gestations on a test floor versus the what we call sort of our control floor. Not much difference, right, in terms of total width of gap and slant. And so we looked at postural changes. We did a lot of video recording, a lot of monitoring of these animals. We looked at hoof lesions. We had a feet first shoot so we could raise them up and take all kinds of pictures and measurements, et cetera, and a force plate scale, which basically, all the animals went through these twice during each pregnancy. And the force plate scale actually measures the weight distribution on each limb. So you can see a predisposition or a likelihood even before lameness is seen. And so we were hoping to, and then of course very key is the manure handling and pen air quality, as well as overall reproductive performance. We were hoping to come up with some guidelines. So we did this comparison over 2 gestations, and what we found was that the narrower slats and gilts, even though there was no these major differences, there tended to be lower feet lesion scores, and that was with both the soles as well as the claws that we were looking at, and improved comfort indicators being those in terms of postural changes as well as the force plate scale. That was the narrow one. But overall, there were no differences in sow body condition, weight changes, reproductive performance, and no difference in manure buildup or air quality, okay, with these narrower ones. So basically, we're not totally confident because we didn't see the huge significant differences that we thought we might, but the indicators certainly are there that the narrower slat is beneficial, and the smaller gap, particularly for gilts. That's your very vulnerable group. You put them in and want them to get through that first parity without going lame, without having lesions on their soles, without catching their toes in the gaps, so that they go on to 2, 3, 4 parities. So especially for those animals, we are certainly recommending this narrower. And this actually, the flooring study was in the Canadian Hog Journal in the summer of 2018. So anyone who wants details, either talk to me after or have a look at this article. Since I'm just sort of providing an overview, and because of the time I realize we're at, I'd like to hopefully have a few moments for some questions and that. I'm just going to talk very briefly about the feeding strategy and the choice of the system as it contributes to lameness. And we're certainly aware that this is central to your design of group housing, and that feed availability is certainly a source of competition. And feeding-related aggression is going to impact your welfare, your body condition score, all of those things, and obviously productivity. I've heard about this already, the 2 types of systems, competitive versus non-competitive systems, higher management for the non-competitive, some challenges that can be there in terms of inter-sow aggression and the potential of that intercell aggression to contribute, whereas the non-competitive feeding systems that provide that protection, there is no feed aggression. They're not competing for the feed, but as few have mentioned, and many of you would know, there can be aggression outside that feeder, and so we have to be very careful about that flooring out there and how that is set up. That's been alluded to today as well. And feed intake is something that we sometimes don't talk about, okay, as how important. I'm not talking about just the quantity, although that is very important. And I know in our research here we have some recent experience with that in terms of making sure that they have enough feed, but also it is the making sure that the nutrient density and the right micronutrients are there. I'm not a nutritionist, so I'm not going to go into that. But I think we all appreciate the importance of that. And if you're considering factors, you have an issue with lameness, it's something you need to look very carefully at. And if you're raising your own gilts, so you're talking to someone else here, and I agree totally, they need to be raised for breeding. That is, they need to be raised to stay around a long time. They have to have very strong bones. And that usually is not done by putting them onto a finisher ration as gilts up for the breeding. So inadequate, we recognize the problems, pregnancy loss, lower faring rate, etc., etc. And the other aspect is increasing fiber in the diet. Because if the animals, your sows, are hungry, they're going to be aggressive. And as I mentioned, we've had experience with that as well in terms of gilts that not settling down. They just needed more feed. Increase the fiber in their diet, they were fine. So the choice of the feeding system will influence aggression, incidence of lameness, body condition variation, and productivity. Of course, these things are all coming back to productivity and economic outcome. Mixing sows, Jennifer did a nice job of talking about that, so I just will very, very quickly. We know that they have to be in a social hierarchy. They have to settle themselves, but I maintain they do not have to fight to do that. Some sows will. Nothing you can do about it. That's just the way they are. They need to fight, but a lot of sows do not have to fight, and if they can, they will avoid fighting. They may encounter, okay, there's a potential for an agonistic that is a potentially aggressive interaction. If they can get away, they will. Hence why we want to provide enough space for them to retreat and to have actual partitions and whatnot. When you get, obviously you get fighting, you get injuries, but also increase the likelihood with all that movement and scrambling around of lameness, okay, and injuries of a more serious nature. And especially if you're on concrete and inappropriate size slats. Ample space, pen design, as I mentioned, mixing pen potential. Haven't seen too much of that, certainly in North America. It just takes up extra space, but if you can manage it, because it provides extra space at the time, it can be very advantageous. Summarily, adequate quantity, enough space, how that space is set up, and what's in that space is going to contribute to sow comfort. And I think we all agree that that really is very important, because if she's comfortable, and she's going to be producing optimally. Stability of your social hierarchy in that group and leads to the things that we really want, and that's increased productivity, longevity, and a lowering of operating costs. So, summing, consideration to minimize distress and lameness, at least the recommended space allowance. Crowding, there's no good payoff for that. Maybe in the short term, but not. Appropriate flooring, allowance for separate areas that are key resource, escape routes, mixing pens, staple social groups, and the last one, which has been also mentioned today, totally agree, people are the key. And we were talking about lameness, the ability to be attentive and identify early on what that lameness is occurring, and to really see that and to treat it. Know what the treatment is. So, yeah, this is just about people as much as the investment in the housing design is important. Always the investment in training of your skilled stock people will pay dividends. So I'm kind of hoping that I will just sort of, that's a key one. Because Doug is sort of wandering around there. I think he's trying to, stop, he's saying. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
We'd like to thank Dr. Connor for I will try my best to run as fast as I can. Are there questions? I know the lameness and type of flooring and that. Here's somebody that has done research on it. Are there any questions out there?
Well, if I can just share while you're formulating your question, the organizers actually asked me to talk about causes and prevention. And I thought, if I knew how to truly prevent, I'd probably be a millionaire, right? There are strategies, but there's a whole combination of things.
So we do have one that came in off the web here, and we probably answered it, but it's asking, what is the ideal slat opening?
The ideal slat opening. Okay. Without giving a specific number, I guess what can we say? That the ideal slat opening certainly allows for the pushing of manure and liquids through, but not that there's going to be actual toes and claws caught in them. And normally, if the animal is anatomically correct, the claws themselves are not going to be long enough to get in. It's those toes, right, that they're going to get caught. So, and we find that even with that 19 or that 19 millimeter, which is just that 3/4 inch, that's probably about it, right? You need that. You need at least. You need. I shouldn't say at least. You need that to get the manure and the liquid through. But even, you think, okay, what's 1/4 of an inch? Well, if you look at the sow's toes and feet relative to those gaps, it's quite a bit. It's quite significant when they're out there moving around really fast in that sort of environment that if they're crowded and they're trying to avoid and they're not really looking where they're going. If you put them onto something wider, okay, yeah, they can get around okay, but they've got to be paying attention. Right? That's what we notice certainly in the kinematics is that they'll move, but there's things like their actual way in which they move and get around is changed. Sorry.
Question over here.
Do you have an actual linear footage per sow of wall that's suggested?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Very simple. I do not have a linear footage of wall. You're talking about for them to lie against? Very good question. I know that in terms of the partitions, that usually the 6 to 7, if you go up to around the 7 feet for those type of partitions that they'll lie against, then they tend to not be stuck out into the slats. Does anyone else, I should ask, anyone else have a comment on that? That is my understanding and my experience. But I don't know otherwise if you're talking about, because they will also, you put them in those bedroom type of situations, they'll form nice little groups and they seem very happy doing that. If happy's a word I can use, I'm not sure if that's acceptable.
I just had a comment. When we were building, we spoke with John Van England.
Yes.
And he does a lot of trials with his sows. And he actually told us to do the 6 or 7 feet, like the depth.
Mm-hmm.
But he actually told us to go 14 feet wide rather than the standard 10 or 12 because a lot of times they'll go nose to nose.
Yes.
And it'll allow them to be nose to nose in that special area as well.
Thank you very much for that. I totally agree with that. I know that in some systems in other countries that's exactly where they're going to the larger. Great, thank you.
Yeah, I just wondered if you had any opinion on flooring for the sows in the farrowing crates. Whether something solid or something slanted is preferable there.
Good question. You're asking for my opinion. That's a safe one. I don't necessarily think that the solid is and I don't. Someone else may have some experience other than in group sort of systems. I haven't got any experience with it truly being solid. More the experience with either it being like a plastic coated type of mesh or the solid cast iron type of thing. And my experience with the solid cast iron with the gaps actually being parallel, which I think is probably the most common, it tends to work very well. In our study, we did notice that once those sows were off of the test and control floors, which were newly poured floors, so when they went into farrowing, and then during the breeding period, their hooves improved. And so, for those of you who, and hopefully you do, if you've got sows in farrowing, look at those feet, and those would be the sort of thing. But other than that, I know that the mesh ones are not necessarily as forgiving as you might think. On feet, they tend to slip a bit more. But if anyone else has experience, I would appreciate that. Are we being cut off? Oh, okay.
One last question before we continue on. Not seeing any with that, I'd like to once again thank you for coming out from warm Winnipeg.
Oh, yes.
We really